Hello and welcome, I'm your CodeMonkey. In this lecture we're going to build the delivery counter. This is where we're going to drop some items that the customers have requested in order to complete the orders. Also, just for fun, we're going to learn how to use ShaderGraph to make a simple custom shader. Okay, so let's begin by making our counter. So let's go into our base counter, let's create a new prefab variant for the delivery counter. Let's go inside and now let's find the visual for delivery counter. Let's duplicate it to make the selected. Let's go inside, modify the material. Then on the selected, make it 1% bigger, 101, add the component, the selected counter visual. Let's drag the kitchen counter like that. Okay, that's our basic setup. And also start with the kitchen counter disabled. Okay, great. Now let's make a script to run this. So let's go into our counters folder and let's create a brand new C# script for the delivery counter. Let's attach it and open. Okay, so now here as usual, let's begin by extending our base counter class. All right. Now let's override the interact function. And for now, let's actually do it exactly like the trash counter, meaning let's just destroy the object. So we just check if the player is holding something. So if the player has a kitchen object, let's go into the player, the kitchen object, and let's destroy it. However, another rule over here for the delivery counter is this is only going to accept plates. So let's see if the player is carrying a plate object. So player get kitchen object and test try to get the plate. So out plate kitchen object for the plate kitchen object. We try to get this, and if it is a plate, then we destroy it. Okay, that's it. Here in the editor, let's just compile the script and drag the references. So the countertop point, and on the selected, let's drag the counter reference and let's exit this, save the prefab. And let's drop it over here on the corner. So let's find over here the delivery counter. Let's put it over there. Angle it on this side. Put it like this. Let's also just quickly reposition all of our counters since we already have all of the types that we're going to use. So on delivery counter, let's put it over here on this corner. So X 7.5, 0, and Z of 2. Then next to it, let's put the plates counter. So over there, okay. Then next to it, let's put a clear counter. After that, let's put the trash counter. And then let's also put another empty one there. So let's duplicate this one, move it up to about this and put it like that. Now we just need to move all of these down here. So just select all of these counters and let's move them down by about this. Okay, so on minus 5.5 like this. Okay, so everything is nicely positioned. Just over there right now we cannot access that container. So let's actually modify those as well. Which by the way, over here there's the canvas in front. So as I click, I'm actually selecting the canvas in the hierarchy. So here's a quick inti tip. On the hierarchy, on the left side, you've got these two buttons. So one of them hides the object and the other one simply makes it unselectable. So if I click on this and I click through, any of the click goes through the canvas. So that makes it much easier to select over here all the items in our scene. So let's just select all of these. Okay, all of these. Now just push them all to the side and make another empty one and put it over here. Okay, that's a nice layout. Now let's just finish the rest. So over here, let's just duplicate our empty counters and place a bunch more. Let's put one more to the side. And now these ones over here, so let's put it over there and rotate it here. And duplicate another one, and another one, and another one, and just one more. And get rid of this one. Okay, great. So here we have pretty much our complete map. Let's also just move the camera a tiny bit, just make sure that it is nicely organized. So put it over there, just so everything is nice and centered. Okay, so there's our map. Now let's get back to working on our delivery counter. We already added this code, so let's just quickly test. So here we are, and if I pick up something like, for example, some cheese, go into the delivery counter and interact, and nope, nothing happens because that one only accepts plates. Now if I pick up a plate, go there, deliver, and yep, there you go, it does work. Okay, great. So this is the basic logic that we want. For defining the actual recipe logic, we're actually only going to do that in the next lecture, but for now, let's add one more nice thing. Let's add a simple custom visual over here using ShaderGraph. This is a great way for you to learn the power of ShaderGraph and just how easy it is to use. This is a visual tool for making shaders. It's really very easy. Personally, I don't know how to write shaders with code, but I can build some pretty nice things using ShaderGraph. As usual, I have a dedicated video on it. I also have an entire playlist showcasing how to make all kinds of interesting effects, and even one special video covering some changes in recent ShaderGraph versions. So over here, let's learn the basics how to use it. So first here in our project window, let's create a brand new folder. Let's name it just shaders. And now inside, let's create one. So let's create, then go up here into ShaderGraph. Then we're using URP, so let's go inside there. And here we've got a bunch of options. Now, don't worry about picking the quote-unquote wrong option. All this does is just create a template. So for example, if you accidentally create an unlit shader, you can then easily swap it out for lit. So right now, let's go with the unlit shader. And for the name, let's name it moving visual. Okay, there's our shader graph file. Now let's just double click to open it. And up here we have the nice shader graph window. By the way, you can make this full screen. So you can either right click over there on the tab and maximize, or alternatively, you can just click on this window and you can use the hotkey Shift Space. And yep, there you go, it does maximize. Okay, great. Now by default, we have this down the center. This is called the master stack. These are the actual properties that we're going to need to use. Then on the left side, we have the properties Blackboard. On the right side, we've got the graph inspector. And finally, down here, we've got the main preview. All of these windows can be scaled. And also, if you don't see these windows, or if you accidentally hide them, they're all up here on these three buttons. So the Blackboard, that's on the left, the graph inspector, and the main preview. Okay, so now here we've got a nice empty board, so we can add whatever nodes we want. So we can right click and go into create node, and then we can write something, or just click anywhere and press on space, and there you go. Now we can cycle through and browse all of these menus to see all of the nodes that exist. There's tons and tons of them. Or alternatively, just go up here and use the search bar. So for example, let's find the sample texture to the node. So here it is, this one. Okay, we've got this node. What this one does is it takes a texture and grabs the color from it. So on the left side of the node are the inputs, and on the right side are the outputs. Within the parentheses, you can actually see the types. So for the input texture, this one is of type T2, so that means it's a texture 2D. Then on the output, you can see there's a 4, meaning it contains 4 floats, which in this case refers to the 4 colors. So that's red, green, blue, and alpha. So for an input, we want a texture, so let's add it over here as a property. Let's click on the plus icon, and we've got a whole bunch of types. For the texture, we want a texture 2D, so let's go with that. And then for the name, now usually there are two standard names. There's one called main text or base map. Main text used to be the more common name, but when working with URP, for some reason they decided to name the main texture as base map. So over here, let's stick within the URP standard and just call this base map. Okay, there's our property, and if we click the selected, and on the right side we can see the graph inspector, and we can see all the properties for this actual property. So we see a name, reference, and a bunch more things. Now the really important one is over here, the reference. This is the actual name that you're going to use if you want to interact with this shader through code. The name on the property, this one is just a text string, so this can be whatever you want. You can even have spaces and so on. Whereas the reference name, this is the really important one. And by default, when you set up a name, it should already set the correct reference. Usually the standard is to name it just like the name, both without any spaces and with an underscore in the beginning. So just like this. Okay, then we can give it a default texture. So let's go ahead and select something. For example, over here, the bread texture. Remember, this is just the default. This will not be hard-coded directly into the shader. We can then modify this. Okay, so we have our nice base map property definition. Now we can just drag it over here on the board, and yep, there it is. And now we can just click on the circle icon in order to drag a connection, and let's connect it over here onto the sample texture to the input. And yep, right away we do see it does work, so we are correctly sampling the texture. However, if you look on the main preview, over here there's still nothing. That's because we don't have this node connect to anything. We need to connect it to the final master stack in order to render something. So again, on the output over here we can see a 4, so these are all of our colors. And actually, one very useful node is the preview, since so many things in shader graph can be hard to visualize. So we can move these nodes around, and let's add the preview node. And this does exactly that, so you can fit it an input, and you can see down here what that input contains. So for example, let's drag just the red channel, and if there you go, over there we can see the red channel for this texture. We can drag the green channel, the blue channel, or look at the alpha channel. Yep, there you go, it does work. So this preview node is super useful for being able to see what your shader is actually doing. Over here we have the colors, so let's get rid of the preview right now. And in order to make it work, we really just need to connect the RGBA and go up here into the base color. And right away it should work, but you might not be able to see anything over here on the main preview. I believe this is a rendering bug in the current tech version, so right now nothing is shown. So if you still don't see anything, it's actually pretty simple. Just go up here on the top left side and make sure to save the asset. Okay, save it, great. Then let's exit from our maximize view. And now let's close this tab. Let's click on play just to play the game. Now let's stop playing. And now if we open the shader again, yep, there you go. Now we do see the shader compiling over there, that color, that is the shader compilation. And after a little bit, it should work. Let's just maximize this. So yep, there you go. There we do see our texture. Okay, great. So again, this is just a simple rendering bug on the current tech version. If you're watching this video in the future, chances are you don't even have this bug, so there's no need to worry. Okay, so right now we do see it working. We can see our bread texture, and it's currently being applied on a sphere. For our use case, we're working with 2D textures, so this would be best to be seen on a quad. So we can right click over here on the preview in order to select the preview mesh. So let's go with a simple quad, and yep, there it is, we have our nice quad. Okay, great. So over here we have our basic shader. All it does is just shows a texture, that's it. Now let's actually use this. And first, let's always make sure to save the asset. On the top left side, on the moving visual, if you see an asterisk here, that means you have unsaved changes. So always make sure to save them. In my case, I don't, but still, never hurts to save. Now over here in scene view, let's go inside our delivery counter, so let's open it. And now for the display for our arrow, let's make it a flat quad. So let's right click in the hierarchy, let's create a new 3D object, and let's make it a quad. Let's call this the delivery arrow. Let's place this on top of the counter, so let's rotate it to face upwards. By the way, on the rotation, make sure the color is facing upwards. Most shaders by default, they only render one face and not the other one. So make sure you put the face with the color upwards and not the other one. Okay, so let's rotate this one upwards. So there we go, 90 over there. And let's just put it just exactly on top of the counter. So just enough so that it's visible. Okay, great. So now let's make a material for our arrow. So let's go inside the materials folder, and over here, let's create a brand new material. Let's call this the delivery arrow. Let's make sure to use this material on the quad, so let's just drag it over there on the mesh render. Okay, so it's using our custom material. And over here on this shader graph drop-down menu, over here we can select what shader we want to use. So in our case, let's go inside the folder shader graphs. And inside, yep, here we have our moving visual shader. So let's go ahead and use this. And yep, right away we do see that it does work. Here we have our texture being drawn exactly on top of our material. Okay, so far so good. Now again, here, remember one very, very important thing that I said. The texture that you define the shader, over here the default for the property, this one is only the default. The important one is the one that we have on the material. I'm emphasizing this point because I've seen a bunch of people make this mistake. If you modify default texture whilst inside the shader, like for example, if I change here from bread, let's say into the cabbage slices, if I modify that, note how it does not modify any materials that were created. We are only changing defaults. So if you want to change the texture that is actually used, make sure you change the one on the material that you created and not the default. I changed the default but did not change this shader. However, if I now were to make another material, which by the way, here's a quick tip, you can right click directly on the shader file and go into create and create new material, and it will automatically create the material using that shader. And actually here it didn't update default just because I didn't save the shader. So I modified this one for the cabbage slices, and now if I save the asset, and now if I right click there and I create a brand new material, and yep, now that one does have the new default. But again, remember, what you set over here is just the default. What really matters is what is on the material. After the material has been created, modifying the default here does nothing. So always keep that in mind. In most cases, you want to be changing the property on the material itself, not the default on the shader. Okay, let's just clean up both of these. All right, so let's continue. Now here we have our sprite working, okay, except we don't want to show some bread, so let's actually use the proper arrow sprite. So let's select this one. And yep, it does work, it is printing the sprite. However, one obvious thing is that the arrow is not transparent like it should be, so let's solve that. Back in our shader graph, in order to make this a transparent shader, we need to actually go into the graph settings. So in the graph inspector, go into graph settings, and over here you see a bunch of settings that relate to the graph itself and not any selected property. So let's go into graph settings. For example, like I mentioned a while ago, you can modify between lit and so on. So this is where you would change that. You can also up here add multiple targets. So you can create a shader in shader graph and make it work with the universal render pipeline or the high definition render pipeline or the built-in render pipeline. All of those are supported through shader graph. Now for our goal, in order to make this a transparent shader, let's just go over here onto surface type, and instead of opaque, let's change to transparent. And as soon as we do, look what happens there, and if there you go, it adds a brand new alpha channel. If we just save the asset right now, and nope, look at that, it still doesn't work, it's still not transparent. Basically we made this shader transparent, but now we need to feed in the transparent channel over here onto the alpha. This is the one thing that is different from a previous version of shader graph. Previously, you could just feed the alpha channel over here onto the base color, and shader graph would automatically apply it. But in recent versions, you need to add it over here separately. So if you have any issues with transparency when following some older shader graph tutorials, always remember this change. I covered that along with some other changes in a very useful video. So if you're following along some older shader graph tutorials, make sure you watch that video to learn what you need to do to update them to the latest version. Okay, so here on the sample texture, we already have the alpha channel, so we just connect this onto the master alpha. And right there, we already see it working. Let's just go ahead, save our asset. And here in scene view, yep, there you go, now we do see our arrow. Now, one more small thing. You might notice that from some angles, it's not exactly transparent. Basically, it actually is transparent, but since we made this a lit shader, sometimes the light might make the transparent parts visible. One option to solve that is over here on the graph settings. Instead of making it lit, let's make it unlit. That would work. So yep, with the unlit shader, the transparency is perfect. But if you really want to keep it lit, then the other thing you can do is just over here play around with these settings. You've got smoothness, AO, and so on, and over here you can even modify the workflow mode. So for transparency, instead of making it metallic, let's go with a specular workflow. And then over here, set the smoothness to 1 and the ambient occlusion down to 0. And now if we save this shader, and look at that, and yep, now the transparent parts are indeed fully transparent. Finally, over here on the right side on the mesh render, if you want, you might want to play around over here with the cast shadows. So maybe you don't want this one to cast shadows, maybe you don't want it to impact light probes, and so on. Okay, so with this we have our nice transparent arrow. Let's make sure to save our delivery counter, so let's go outside back into scenes, and let's hit on play. And yep, there you go, we have our transparent counter with our nice arrow. Now we want the arrow to actually move. And doing that is actually super simple. Going back here in our shader graph, let's just modify default just so we can see the arrow that we want to see. So let's select the arrow sprite. Okay, there's our arrow. Now for moving, over here on the sample texture, we've got an input for the UV. The UV is what defines what portion of the texture we're going to grab, which by default just gets the whole texture. So since this field represents where we're going to grab from texture, by playing around with this we can grab different parts. So to do that, let's just add a standard UV node. So here it is. This is the standard UV channel. So if we connect this, then nothing changes. Everything still renders exactly the same. But now we can modify this. And to do that, we're really just going to use some basic math. Remember that when working with shaders, even though you do see colors, everything is really just numbers. So a UV2 is just a number, the color is just a number, the alpha is just a number. So visually, everything might look like images, might look like colors, but really in the end, it's all just numbers. So for example, how do we move this texture? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We just add a number onto it. So over here on the UV, let's just add an add node. So this just adds two numbers together, very basic. So let's take the regular UV and let's add something on top of it. For example, we can make a vector 2 and let's put it on, say, 0.10. And let's add this one onto this one. And now if we drag this one onto the input, look over there on the preview what happens. And if there you go, look at that, it moves slightly to the left. So if I modify this one, put it on 0, there you go, at that, 0.1 on that, 0.2 on that, and so on. So you can see that by modifying here, I'm essentially offsetting the texture. I'm offsetting on the X, and over here I can also offset it on the Y. Basically, I'm offsetting the texture by 10%. The UV is a normalized value. This is not pixels. So that is why 0.1 is 10% regardless of how big the texture is. And if we go way past 1, then the texture essentially loops back. So this is really all we need. For our moving arrow, we're going to have 0 on the Y, and on the X, we're going to constantly either increase or decrease. That's how we're going to have our moving arrow. So again, the only issue here is that I'm modifying this manually. We don't want a fixed amount on the shader. Instead, we want a nice animation. So for that, we have the very useful, the time node. This one has various time-based outputs. The one that we want for this case is the time, which is just the total time. This one is constantly increasing since the start of the game by the number of seconds. So if you use this over here directly on the add, and there you go, look, that texture is constantly scrolling. Okay, so that's great, except obviously we have one issue. We don't want it to scroll diagonally. We only want to scroll in one direction. So for that, we can essentially create a simple property to act as our speed. So let's over here on the blackboard, let's create a new vector 2, call it our speed property. And for default, let's default on, say, 0.1 on the X, 0 on the Y. And now if I drag the speed over here onto our blackboard, okay, great. This is basically a multiplier, so we just need to multiply the time by this. So let's add a multiply node. Also, by the way, quick tip over here on each node, you've got a nice little arrow, so if you want to make it a bit more compact, so if you don't actually need to see the preview, so make that. And in this case, let's take our time, multiply by our speed, and then for the output, pass it into the add. Okay, so look at that, now it is indeed moving in this direction. And over here on the speed, we can play around the values. So if we put it at 0.5, now it's moving faster. And if I put it on the Y, now it's moving diagonally, put it 0 on the X, and now it's only moving vertically. Okay, so this is really what we want. Let's just go ahead, save our shader, and now let's just select our delivery arrow material. And over here, yep, we've got the speed. If you don't see it, make sure that on the speed property over here you have it exposed. So we have the speed, instead of moving on the Y, let's move on the X. And actually like this, it's reverse going backwards. So over here we can just put a negative value. So let's put it on -1. And if there you go, now the arrow is moving perfectly. Also here, let me make one important note. Just in case you're using this shader with a custom texture instead of the one included in the course, if you do that, make sure that the texture that you use, so over here I'm using the arrow texture. Over here on the arrow import settings, down here under wrap mode, make sure it is set to repeat. If you set it as clamp, you might get some weird visuals or nothing at all. In order for the texture to constantly loop and constantly repeat itself, that one needs to be set to repeat. Okay, so here it is in game and we have a really nice moving texture. For that, we created a simple but really nice, useful custom shader. Definitely go ahead and watch the various effects that I made in the Shader Graph playlist. This tool is super useful, definitely make sure you know how to use it. I've used it for making a building effect, I've made some nice outlines, a really nice wind shader, also a really interesting dissolve effect, and even a cool transition shader just like in the game Hades. So this really is a super powerful tool, make sure you watch that playlist to really learn how to use it. Alright, so here we learned about Shader Graph and created a really nice custom shader. However, the delivery counter still only has a visual, so let's create some proper logic for generating and delivering the correct recipes in the next lecture.